and this is the history of series.
Cynthia Brown, whose descendants were in Wilmington back in 1898, is a historian at her church where there's a preserved copy of the Declaration from the next day's newspaper.
We will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin.
Let my niggas live. We giants live off the land lions. Post with iron, no crying rolls. Let my niggas live. Hey yo, let my niggas live. Handle your big kill, no kids.
I scream at the mirror, curse, asking God why me. Running the black church, gun in my hand, y'all try me. I'm God's son, son of man, son of Marcus Garvey.
This is for those that's lost like the Bermuda Triangle.
I'm spiritual and I'm real.
I'm here to wake y'all up.
Man, come on, man. You're supposed to grow and change, man. I'm forever gonna be a blood, because that's what I am. A black man leading others out of darkness. That's my definition of it.
$1 billion ambition. History always repeats itself, so it's important that you educate yourself on historical facts.
In the late 1800s, Wilmington, North Carolina was the state's largest city. It had a majority black population, and historians today describe it as a rarity in the post-Civil War American South.
Wilmington, prior to November 1898, was what the New South could be at the cusp of the 20th century.
There was an unusual degree of black prosperity.
In Wilmington, there were successful black entrepreneurs, doctors, teachers, but also black elected officials. And for a time, that was true throughout the state. Take a look at the politicians on this poster of the 1889 North Carolina House of Representatives. Here at the bottom are black Republican representatives, some from Wilmington. North Carolina also sent 4 black Republicans to the U.S. Congress between 1875 and 1899. The Democratic and Republican parties of 1898 in many ways occupied opposite parts of the political spectrum than they do today.
Most African Americans were voting for the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party was white voters almost exclusively. White supremacy was the central focus of the platform for the Democratic Party.
Republicans in North Carolina were successful in part because of a third party called the Populist Party, made up of mostly white farmers fed up with the tough economic times. North Carolina populists joined up with Republicans to form what they called the Fusion Party. And in the elections of 1894 and 1896, the Fusion Party defeated the Democrats in sweeping victories statewide. That meant North Carolina now had a government that shared power between black and white politicians, including a newly elected Republican governor. Together, they moved towards reforms that would favor black Americans and working-class whites.
This was something that the Democratic Party folks were simply not going to accept.
A multiracial government wasn't just a disappointment for Democrats. It was more like a humiliation. They needed a plan to take back control of the state in the next election. So party leaders like Furnifold Simmons, future U.S. Senator, Charles Aycock, future North Carolina governor, and this man, Alfred Moore Waddell, came up with one: to beat the Fusion Party by luring white populist voters away from their alliance with black voters. Wilmington, with a large black population and a local fusion government in power, would be a focus of their campaign. The State Democratic Party Handbook for 1898 laid out their goal: consolidate the white vote by stoking white anger and resentment. It said, "This is a white man's country, and white men must control and govern it."
Imagine a contraption that could take us backward. The world was run by black men. Back to the future, anything could happen.
We all know that Christopher Columbus was not the first to sail the Atlantic Ocean, and many people now seem to be aware that other people also sailed the Atlantic. But seldom do we explore when Africans did so. It's said that an African king of the Mali Empire named Abubakar Keita II sailed the Atlantic Ocean long before Columbus, a whole century before him to be exact. Now, the success of his trip is a mystery, but the fact that he did this is well documented by Mansa Musa himself. The Arab-Egyptian scholar named Al-Umari, who spoke with Mansa Musa concerning how he ascended the throne, wrote down what the Malayan king told him.
In 1562, English navigator Sir John Hawkins became the first English slave trader, transporting slaves from West Africa to the Spanish West Indies. One of his notable investors was Elizabeth I, Queen of England.
Northern Europeans started to create footholds in the Caribbean. As I said, the first were the English, and really you have to say the beginning of encroachment into the Caribbean began from Bermuda.
It was during my second voyage to the Bermudas that I became the first European to set foot on the islands. I found them to be a beautiful and peaceful place, with an abundance of fish and fruit. Unfortunately, my peaceful exploration of the islands was cut short when I was attacked by the local inhabitants.
Niggas know where the fuck we at in the motherfucking hood, you heard?
My name is Juan de Bermudez, and I was a Spanish explorer and navigator who lived during the 16th century. I was born in the town of La Puebla de Montalban, which is located in the province of Toledo, Spain. As a young man, I joined the Spanish Navy and participated in several expeditions to the New World. In 1505, I was given command of a ship and sent on a mission to explore the waters around the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. During this voyage, I discovered a group of islands that were later named after me, the Bermudas.
Bermuda is just a very small island chain of sort of hilly limestone islands. Basically in the middle of the Atlantic, close to what's today the Carolinas. But not too far also from the Bahamas and Cuba. And Bermuda, the English had known of Bermuda for many years, and technically it was included under the charter that the English crown granted to the Virginia Company.
This is the first landing spot. It's called the Bermuda Landing. So many ancestors were brought to this spot that we don't even have a calculation on the numbers. But this is the first spot before the historical slave trade of Africans being brought from Comfort, Hampton, Virginia, to Richmond, Virginia. They were brought to this spot first, then took into Richmond, Virginia.
So the same set of people, the same set of investors and adventurers who were authorized to colonize the Chesapeake also could lay claim to Bermuda. And at that time, it was totally uninhabited. There were no colonists or indigenous people. No humans, as far as we know, had ever lived on Bermuda. In the year 1609...
Bermuda's English settlers, the presence and direct outcome of the wreck of the Sea Venture in 1609, were engaged in various economic ventures.
An English ship bound to Virginia, which included cargo and goods and administrators and also forced laborers, indentured servants. This ship called the Sea Venture crashed in a hurricane and happened to run aground right near Bermuda. And all the passengers were able to get ashore safely on Bermuda. And they began to set up a society there that could subsist and manage to feed itself in the environment of the islands. Now, this is not what the Virginia Company wanted. They wanted those people to proceed to Virginia, where they would do important labor in trying to build up this largely failing colony at Jamestown. And so not long after, a further fleet of ships was sent to sort of forcibly collect these people from Bermuda and send them on to Virginia, but 3 refused and were able to avoid capture, basically, and remain on Bermuda. And so this was the first permanent human habitation, these 3 refuseniks who stayed in Bermuda. And eventually the Virginia Company recognized that it would be very much to their advantage to have a permanent way station in the ocean at Bermuda.
The Triangle Trade Route was the infamous 3-legged journey where cargo was carried from Europe to Africa, slaves from Africa to the West Indies, and sugar and cotton from the West Indies to Europe. But it was the second leg of what eventually became thousands of voyages, the route from Africa to the West Indies, that became known as the Middle Passage, along which more than 20 million African men and women died, and 15 million survived to face a strange and terrifying new world.
So in 1612, they sent 60 families over who were able to more or less hang on and survive and begin subsisting on those islands. In 1616...
In 1616, two men, a black man and an Indian, were brought to the island to die for pearls. Although these two were brought here as indentured servants and not slaves, any distinction between the two categories changed fairly quickly.
The colonists who were trying to set up farms to both to support themselves and also produce cash crops to export, some of them began to obtain slaves who had been raided from other colonies, particularly the Dutch and Portuguese.
As early as 1444, the Portuguese imported the first African slaves into the colony of Madeira, off the west coast of Morocco. Alongside slaves from Eastern Europe and the Canary Islands, Africans worked Madeira's sugar plantations.
Raiders had more or less stolen from the Spanish colonies, and that they could claim, oh, we liberated them, but in fact they were just, treating them as merchandise to be stolen and resold somewhere else. And again, the Bermudan colonists really needed these enslaved people, particularly for their skills. And soon they had some success in growing tobacco. But as often happens, this didn't last for very long. Tobacco tends to exhaust the soil quickly, and there wasn't very much fertile land in Bermuda. And also there was competition. As Virginia and Maryland produced more, the prices dropped and tobacco became less profitable. And so Bermuda fairly quickly transitioned to becoming a sea base, really focused on the industries of shipping, shipbuilding, and repairing, and they moved away from this attempt to make money on big plantation agriculture. And so Bermuda ended up becoming the main base and model, really, the first kind of blueprint for how Northern Europeans could encroach and create colonies using the skills of seafaring and shipbuilding, as well as enslaved African labor, to expand into the Caribbean. So other English colonies followed down in the West Indies proper, and they tended to start with small temporary encampments that would serve just as bases for merchants and raiders and pirates of various sorts. But then those were followed by more kind of permanent, fortified settlements that tried to create a sustainable food supply and water supply for more colonists and expansion.
Often called an African Holocaust, this trade was possible because of partnerships between various African chiefs.
When Cyrus Sutton said he made the statement that the Moors was involved in the slave trade, is he correct?
They began it.
And Europeans pursuing New World expansion.
Wow. And the Europeans came into it because it was a lucrative market. Your enemy is throwing white power at you. You throw black power at him. But we were attacked because we were successful where we were. The Europeans and the Moors, they saw us planting our crops, tending our fields, and they stole us because they wanted fields planted. They wanted crops tended.
Men and women of the Mandingo.
The Mandinka are a major ethnic group in West Africa and are estimated to contain around 11 million people. They live in many West African countries, but they tend to only dominate certain regions. They're the largest ethnic group in Gambia, the dominant ethnic group in the Casamance region of southern Senegal, a major ethnic group in eastern Guinea-Bissau, and the dominant group in Guinea, where they're the largest group in the northeastern part of the country. The Mandinka descend from the larger linguistic family of the Mande peoples. Some scholars suggest that the Mande group that the Mandinka originated from came from an ancient Central Saharan people. Ashanti are members of the Akan cluster of ethnic groups. Their language, variously known as Ashanti or Twi, is also often called Akan, but is actually one of a number of separate Akan languages, all of which belong to the Kwa subgroup of the Niger-Congo language family. The Ashanti are often considered a sort of custodian of the nation's culture because of the power, artistic splendor, and the duration of their empire, which covered nearly all of present-day Ghana by 1800. Today, The Ashanti number more than 5 million people, or some 28% of the total population of Ghana. Ashanti oral accounts of the group's origin vary. According to one account, their ancestors are descended from the rulers of the ancient Wagadu Empire, also known as the ancient Ghana Empire. Ironically, this account forms the very basis for the name of the modern-day nation, Ghana.
And numerous other tribes were uprooted and sold into new lives throughout the West Indies and Bermuda.
They would strip black men of voting rights. They would give white men a large part of the employment heretofore given to black men. And as for Alex Manly, we demand that he leave this city forever within 24 hours. The next morning, hundreds of white men marched to the offices of the Daily Record. Manly was gone. He had fled to save his own life. They set the Daily Record building on fire. This is where it once stood.
Once the white leadership destroyed Alex Manly's printing press, they destroyed one way in which the African American community in Wilmington could organize itself and keep itself informed.
At City Hall, the mayor and board of aldermen were forced out.
There's 200 armed men in City Hall at the time. They didn't do it of their own free will. And as they resigned, a new member selected by the Democratic Party was voted into office.
Waddell, who once threatened to fill the Cape Fear River with black bodies, was the new mayor of Wilmington. Meanwhile, the mob had grown to about 2,000 men, and the violence spilled into the streets. In these photos, X's mark where the first black residents were killed.
The stories are that they were dumped into the river, and there are varying stories about how many people were killed.
I see 40 to 60 clearly as fatalities as a result of the violence, but I think it was higher.
Many black residents hid for days in the swamps and the wooded cemeteries in the city, including Cynthia's great-grandmother. And thousands of other residents fled Wilmington, never to return. Shortly afterward, Democrats printed booklets celebrating a glorious victory, and in the newspapers depicted black residents as the instigators.
This image is a gross misrepresentation of what actually happened during 1898. You know, what you see is African American men with guns, not white men with machine guns.
The city never regained its black majority population. Jim Crow laws like literacy tests and poll taxes that prevented black people from voting were immediately enacted, and Wilmington's spirit of black opportunity was crushed. Black political representation in the state was over. It would be 90 years until North Carolina elected its next black Congress member.
Still somehow I believe we'd always survive.
Still, we will survive no matter what. My people just stay alive. Still, we will survive no matter what. My people just stay alive.
He is asking you a question. What is the warrior's first responsibility?
To serve his king. He says you are wrong.
To honor Allah. Also wrong. The first duty of a Mandinka warrior is to raise a family, to have children, to pass on our way of life.